Chapter 11, Important Clue. For a second, Nancy was tempted to tell Mr. Hurley where the piece of banister and newel had come from. But she decided against this and merely answered, "I found it in a cellar and wondered why it had been sawed off." The carpenter smiled. "For a moment I thought it was like one I saw in a photograph. It might have been removed because it was not perfect. Perhaps it did not match the opposite one on the staircase." Nancy was tempted to say, "Oh yes, it does." Instead, she asked, "Can you tell me how long ago this was sawed off?" "Possibly," Mr. Hurley replied. Using a magnifying glass, he studied the mahogany rail and post. Nancy, Bess, and George exchanged excited glances. By this time, the cousins had guessed what was going through Nancy's mind, and could hardly wait for the carpenter to tell them his conclusion. Finally, he replied, "I'd say from the color of the raw wood, this piece was sawed off about 3 years ago." Nancy was excited. Her hunch had been correct. The wall into which the short side of the banister ran had been put up a good many years after the house was built. According to Mrs. Carrier, Raleigh had had his home constructed 10 years ago. Why, oh why, was that extra wall added? Nancy asked herself over and over. Suddenly it occurred to her that Mr. Hurley could be wrong. She had better not jump to any conclusion until she had more proof. Taking the wood piece from the carpenter, she said, "It was Mrs. Carrier who suggested I come to you. Have you ever been to her brother Raleigh's house?" "No, I haven't, but I understand it's a pretty kooky place." Nancy thanked Mr. Hurley for his help and was about to leave with her friends when the man said, "Wait a minute. I just recalled something. A friend of mine worked in that house. He's the one who told me it's crazy and showed me pictures of it. He'd be glad to tell you about the place, I'm sure. Why don't you go to see him?" "That would be interesting," Nancy replied. "Where is his shop?" "Over in the town of Charlotte. He's easy to find. Right on Main Street, number 27. His name is Custer, Hugo Custer." Nancy told Mr. Hurley she appreciated the information, and the 3 girls said goodbye. On the way to Charlotte, they discussed Nancy's clue about a new wall built by Raleigh. "I hope," Bess said, "that you have no idea of tearing down what you think is a false wall. Why, there could be lots of dangerous things behind there." "Like what?" George asked her. Bess replied that she could imagine all kinds of things. "Snakes and—" George made a face at her cousin. "There are times, Bess, when you come up with the most ghastly ideas. How could snakes possibly live cooped up in a wall with nothing to eat or drink?" Bess was not to be dissuaded. "They could go down through the floor into the outdoors." "Okay, George, what do you think might be behind that wall?" "Something fabulous, like a great treasure," she quickly replied. Bess disagreed. "If that were true, when Raleigh Banister was caught, why didn't he sell the treasure and pay off his debts and bail?" "'Cause he's a crook," George said flatly. Nancy interrupted the argument by saying she thought they had missed the sign to Charlotte. "I'm going to turn around. Girls, please keep your eyes open." She had not gone far in the opposite direction before Bess spotted a small sign with an arrow which pointed to Charlotte. Nancy turned onto the road and 10 minutes later drove into the little village. They found Hugo Custer's shop without any trouble. Fortunately, the carpenter was there and welcomed his callers warmly. "Your friend Mr. Hurley suggested that we come to see you," Nancy said. "We're curious about the Banister house. He said that you have worked there." The carpenter nodded. "I put an extra closet in Mr. Banister's bedroom. That house sure is crazy." "How long ago did you work there?" Nancy queried. "Let me see. It must have been 5 years or more." Nancy's pulse quickened. She wondered what question to ask next, but Mr. Custer went on. "If you want to get inside, I'm afraid I can't be of any help. Raleigh Banister has disappeared. I believe he jumped bail. Too bad he got into trouble. Banister was a talented young man. But he should have known he couldn't break the law and get away with it forever." "That's right," George spoke up. "Nancy's father is a lawyer, so we hear a great deal about such people." Mr. Custer proved to be an exceptionally talkative person. The girls asked a few more questions. "Of all the crazily built things in Mr. Banister's house," he said, "the one that took the prize was the staircase in the center of the big entrance hall. From top to bottom, there were hardly 2 steps in a row that were at the same angle. The whole thing zigzagged. Crookedest, craziest thing I've ever seen. But you know, it was funny. The lower end of it was very graceful and normal." Nancy, Bess, and George leaned forward to hear more. As the carpenter paused, Nancy asked, "Normal in what way?" "Well, the banisters ended in very graceful newels, and the 2 bottom steps were just like any regular ones." "Did Raleigh Banister tell you why he'd had the staircase built that way?" Nancy queried. Mr. Custer said no. "Mr. Banister didn't talk much, and he left me alone most of the time. I certainly didn't get the impression he was queer or abnormal. But I guess he must have been, building his house the way he did. I've quite a few pictures of it. Would you like to see them?" "Oh, yes," Nancy answered. While the carpenter looked through some drawers in an old-fashioned desk, he kept talking about the zigzag house. "I'd seen it from the outside, so when Mr. Banister asked me to come, I took along my camera and some flash bulbs. If I found things as strange inside as I had outside, I was going to take pictures." Nancy glanced at her friends, and George gave her a big wink. She whispered, "This is your lucky day." By this time, Mr. Custer had found the pictures. He laid them on a table and explained each one. Everything was familiar to the girls except the entrance hall. Bess could not suppress a gasp of surprise. The carpenter grinned. "I thought that would give you a start," he said. "I'll bet there isn't another staircase like that one." "No, I guess not," Bess answered. The 3 girls studied the pictures carefully. The staircase was directly in the center of the large hall and showed the full banisters and the 2 newels. Here was proof that sometime during the past 5 years Raleigh had built the extra wall. "I can see you're really intrigued by these snapshots," Mr. Custer said. "I have a few duplicates. Would you like some?" "Indeed I would," Nancy replied. "This is very kind of you, Mr. Custer. Will you let me pay for the prints?" No. I'm happy to give them to you." The man's eyes twinkled. "It isn't often that 3 attractive young ladies come into my shop. We'll call the pictures a souvenir of your visit." "I'm very grateful," Nancy told him. The girls lingered a short while, hoping Mr. Custer might give them more clues. But in a few minutes they realized he had told them all he knew. They expressed their appreciation for his help and left. Nancy looked very happy over the outcome of her visit. "Now all my suspicions are confirmed," she said. "I can hardly wait to get back to Raleigh's house." "Let's not go now," Bess suggested. "It's way past lunchtime and I'm starved." The girls ate in an attractive motel restaurant, then started for Mountainville. Presently Nancy said, "I think we should tell Mrs. Carrier what we learned and show her these pictures." George remarked, "You have to return the key anyway." During the drive, the girls talked about Raleigh Banister and his weird ideas. "Do you think he might turn up again at his home?" Bess asked. George answered, "I doubt it. He's probably too busy gypping people in faraway places." When Mrs. Carrier opened her door, she exclaimed, "Why, girls, how glad I am to see you!" She kissed each one and led the way into her living room. "How is the case going?" she asked. The girls took turns telling about their interesting adventure that day, and Nancy showed the snapshots of Raleigh's house. When Mrs. Carrier saw the picture of the entrance hall, she exclaimed, "How extraordinary! Well, if Raleigh doesn't show up in a reasonable length of time, I believe we should investigate behind that new wall." Then abruptly she changed the subject. "Guess who was here this morning?" "Your brother Thomas?" Bess questioned. "No, guess again." "My dad?" Nancy asked. "No, give another guess." George spoke up. "Ned and Bert and Dave?" Mrs. Carrier shook her head and Nancy said, "I give up." "So do I," said Bess and George. "Well, you're in for a big surprise. Mr. Clyde Mead came to call." End of chapter 11.